Today I'd like to give you an update on EB-5 in 2021. Today I'm going to discuss the changes to the EB-5 rules that were implemented in November 2019. Then I will go on to discuss the adjudication numbers for the I-526 and the I-829 petitions. And finally, I'll discuss the pending sunset of the EB-5 Regional Center program scheduled for June 30, 2021, and my thoughts surrounding the current Grassley bill. As many of you are already well aware, in November 2019, the EB-5 minimum investment amount was increased. The TEA minimum investment amount was increased from $500,000 to $900,000, and the non-TEA minimum amount was increased from $1 million to $1.8 million. Now that we have a new administration, the number one question that we've been getting recently is whether or not there's a possibility of the minimum investment amount going back down to $500,000. The short answer is most likely not. The new EB-5 regulations that were adopted in November 2019 were in fact first introduced during the Obama administration. Whether you were for or against President Trump, I think there's no disagreement that his administration took a lot of actions to slow down immigration to the United States. The November 19 EB-5 regulations, however, were not one of them. The EB-5 minimum investment amounts had not been increased since 1993. So there were lots of efforts throughout the years to try to increase these numbers, and it finally happened in November 2019. It really had nothing to do with President Trump. Another big change in the November 2019 regulations was that the definition of TEA was changed. Without going into the details, let me just explain that because of the definition change, less locations in the United States now qualify for TEA. That means that many projects that qualified for the $500,000 TEA minimum investment amount post-November 2019 actually are now in non-TEA areas, so the minimum investment amount would be $1.8 million. Ironically, the sharp downturn in new investments of EB-5 started occurring in 2018, way before the minimum investment amounts were increased. This was because the bulk of EB-5 investment visa demand originated from mainland China. And because of the way the per-country quota numbers work, already by 2018, it was pretty clear for investors in mainland China that if they started EB-5 then, it would take anywhere from 10 to 20 years to get a conditional green card depending on how you calculated the numbers. So by the time the minimum investment amount increase was announced in July 2019, scheduled to go into effect in November 2019, the EB-5 market had slowed down significantly. Let's take a look at some statistics. As you can see, demand for EB-5 peaked in 2015 and 2016. By 2018, the number of I-526 petitions filed was already cut by 50% compared to the year before. If you look at the 2019 numbers, only 4,194 petitions were filed. Please note that these are U.S. government fiscal year numbers. So when we look at fiscal year 2019, we're talking about the period starting October 1, 2018 to September 30, 2019. Now, if you look at the first quarter numbers for fiscal year 2020, which was in fact the period between October 2019 and December 2019, 4,264 I-526 petitions were filed. You can see that once the announcement of the increased investment amount was made, in this one quarter period, more people filed I-526s in all of fiscal year 2019 combined. But as you can see, once January 2020 came around, only 21 investors invested at the $900 or $1.8 million level, and that number has been pretty low ever since. Maybe if COVID didn't happen, more people would have filed, but I don't necessarily think so. People who are investing in I-526s are pretty much planning to immigrate 2 or 3 years down the line. So the fact that the United States was hit so hard with COVID probably didn't have that much of an impact. We'll come back to this chart again when we talk about adjudications. Please note that I hand-wrote in the last 3 quarters because while these numbers have been announced, they haven't been integrated into the I-526 chart yet. I've provided links to the USCIS website where you can see this chart as well as the broader chart. The downturn in demand, while affected by the $900,000 number, is more affected by the fact that it now takes many, many years to get a green card for people from countries that have always favored EB-5. Now let's look at some adjudication numbers for I-526s and 829s that are already in the pipeline. If we look at the number of approved I-526 petitions, you can see that more than 13,000 I-526 petitions were approved in 2018, but in 2019, those numbers dropped precipitously to 3,659. This was because the Trump administration, as a policy, artificially depressed visa issuance numbers. Basically, they were slow-walking everything. And as a result, if we look at the fiscal year 2020 numbers, while they are very low, you can see that the slowdown in I-526 approvals happened before COVID. Also look at the denial numbers. In 2019, more than 1,000 petitions were denied when only 3,600 or so were approved, while in 2018, the denial numbers were around 1,500, when the approval numbers were over 13,000. While the minimum investment amount will most likely not go back down, we are hoping with a new administration which has a different outlook on immigration will result in petitions being adjudicated more quickly. Let's also look at the I-829 numbers for those of you with outstanding 829 petitions. As you can see, the number of adjudicated petitions were relatively high in 2017 and 2018. This was around the time that the USCIS increased the filing fees and supposedly beefed up its I-829 team. However, again by 2019, these numbers started dropping again. Again, ironically, more I-829s were approved during 2020 at the height of COVID compared to 2019, when all the adjudications were purposely slow-walked. If you look at the far right column, however, the worrying sign is that the number of pending I-829 petitions just keep growing. And because so many people filed I-526s in 2017 and 2018, many more I-829s will be filed in the coming years, making the numbers in the pending column grow bigger and bigger. So this is an area where the USCIS really needs to focus on so that it can get a lot of these petitions out of the pipeline. Also, some of you might remember the January 2020 announcement by the USCIS that they would no longer be reviewing the I-526 petitions FIFO, first in, first out. And the USCIS explained on a stakeholders call that instead that they would be reviewing petitions from non-backlog countries first. In other words, it was basically a policy saying, and they admitted as much on the stakeholders call, that they would be putting Chinese petitions to the side. It sounded like the adjudication timelines for non-Chinese country I-526s would actually go quicker. But we don't know if it was because of COVID or it was just because of the sheer number of I-526's backlog, regardless of the origination. We have not seen a decrease in the I-526 adjudication numbers for I-526s filed from non-Chinese countries. We have, in fact, however, seen Chinese petitions not getting approved, but that hasn't necessarily translated into other country petitions being approved more quickly. Finally, let me discuss two very important pieces of legislation that can potentially impact the future of EB-5. First is the Fairness for High Skills Immigrant Act, known as H.R. 1044 in the House version, which passed last year. Currently in the United States, there's an incredible backlog of EB-2 and EB-3 visas for Indian workers. Depending on how you calculate the numbers, we're talking about backlogs of 30 to 100 years. And there have been a number of efforts to alleviate the pain for many workers who are already here on H-1Bs waiting for their green card. H.R. 1044 was one of those efforts. Unfortunately, instead of trying to address this fundamental problem by increasing visa numbers, the U.S. government is trying to reallocate visa numbers to alleviate the wait times of EB-2 and EB-3 visas. While there are a number of pros and cons to this approach, the issue is rather moot because the legislation failed. Different versions of this act passed the House and Senate in July 2019 and December 2020, respectively. But the legislation failed because the differences between the two versions were not reconciled prior to the end of the 116th session of Congress. To be considered again, this law would have to be reintroduced in the new Congress, passed by the House and Senate, any differences reconciled, and then signed into law by the President. At this time, there is no active legislation in Congress seeking to eliminate per-country limitations for employment-based immigrants. So at least in the immediate to mid-term, it doesn't look like the HR 1044 will impact the EB-5 market. And finally, on June 30, 2021, the Regional Center Program is scheduled to lapse. The Regional Center Program has always been a temporary program since its introduction in the early 90s. And so since the early 90s, the program has been extended generally in 3-year increments. However, this year, the situation is a little bit different. Up until this point, the legislation related to the Regional Center extensions have always been tied to the Appropriations Bill, meaning the budget bill of the United States government. And because the budget was not always passed on time, there have been stress points over the years where the Regional Center Program would lapse when the budget lapsed for a period of maybe a few weeks and even over a month in a couple of instances. But there has never been a question of whether or not the Regional Center Program would actually be extended because the legislation was tied to the budget bill. And obviously, the United States was going to pass the budget, even if there were some delays here and there. However, very recently, the EB-5 legislation was decoupled from the Appropriations Bill, and now it is a standalone bill scheduled to sunset on June 30, 2021. If the Regional Center Program is not extended, the entire system will come collapsing down. So if you don't already have your green cards, even with an approved I-526, because the indirect job count of regional centers will no longer be valid, you will most likely not be able to get your green cards. That said, I don't think it's really a question whether the Regional Center Program will be extended even in a standalone bill. Currently, there's a Grassley-Leahy co-sponsored bill that's being discussed. But what has happened is that the industry has completely lost all leverage in bargaining with the legislators in relation to maybe increasing the visa numbers or other policies that are required in order to revive the Regional Center Program. Because there are thousands of people in the pipeline and billions of dollars of EB-5 financing riding on the bill being passed, personally, I find it hard to conceive of the program not being extended. There will be some tricky issues. For example, maybe we can get a permanent extension so we don't have to go through this every 3, 4, 5 years. Or maybe again, it will only be a temporary extension. Unless we get a permanent extension, it's really hard for the industry to negotiate for other improvements that can alleviate the backlog, which in turn would revitalize the EB-5 marketplace, which in turn would bring more foreign investment to the United States. There are, however, some positive measures in the bill as well. For example, there are investor protection measures that protect good faith investors caught up in bad projects from losing their green cards. So I don't want to raise alarm that all of you in the pipeline are not going to get your green cards. I am, however, pointing out that it's unlikely that we'll see visa number relief in the near future. That's all for today. Please subscribe for more updates. Thank you very much.